Kansas Spray Foam is a proud sponsor of Alpha Media's Ag Summit. And Kansas Spray Foam also does not only installs spray foam insulation, but we also offer consulting and problem solving with insulation needs.
And welcome to the Alpha Ag Summit. And we want to thank all of you for attending on whatever platform you're streaming this program on. Our panel discussion during the first part of the trade panel is brought to you by Kansas Spray Foam Insulation. For more information, go to www.kssprayfoaminsulation.com. Well, as we all know, trade has become a more prominent topic of discussion among agriculture groups. With the Phase 1 trade deal with China, USMCA between the US, Mexico, and Canada, and trade with other countries like Japan, South Korea, and others, what are the next steps to be taken by the Biden administration? We will discuss this in two different areas. The first part of the trade panel will discuss trade policy and with the new administration, which direction it will go. So let us introduce the panelists on today's program. But before we do, if you want to see more about our distinguished panelists, you can go to alphaagsummit.com and click on speakers to learn more about them. So joining us here on the trade policy portion of the panel, let's start with Maria Zieba, who is the Director of International Affairs with the National Pork Producers Council. Also joining us today, Leslie McNitt, who is the Public Policy Director for Trade and Biotech with the National Corn Growers Association. We're also joined today by John Duff, who is the Executive Vice President of the National Sorghum Producers and the Sorghum Checkoff. We're also joined today by Dalton Henry, who is Vice President of Trade Policy with U.S. Wheat Associates. And also joining us on the program, the Senior Director of International Trade and Market Access, Kemp Backus with the National Cattlemen's Beef Association. Now, before we begin, we remind everyone that the views and opinions expressed on this summit are not those of Alpha Media and do not represent the viewpoints of Alpha Ag Network stations, their farm directors, or management. This broadcast is protected by copyright law, and credit should be given whenever sharing or reporting of this video. Now, if you're watching this as well, you can ask questions by going to the chat and asking your questions, as we will bring those up when we get those. So before we get to our questions, let's hear the opening comments from each of the panelists. And let's first start off with Maria Zieba, the NTPC Director of International Affairs for the National Pork Producers Council. Maria, welcome.
Thank you so much for having me on this distinguished panel. I look forward to answering all the various questions, but for our industry, trade has become more and more important over the last 20 years. We export over 25% of our production, and in 2020, that really meant $7.9 billion in exports. 2020, we started the year being very optimistic and hopeful that it was going to be a much better year than the years past on trade. We had resolved some of the China tariff disputes, and we had removed the Mexican retaliation on our pork products. Unfortunately, with COVID-19, that optimism really dwindled quickly as we faced a number of challenges on our supply chain in export markets, with markets being closed and restaurants being closed around the world. So that really created a tough market for our exports. But 2020 overall, I think if you look at the overall picture, it was a positive year. We did see some huge increases in markets like China and Japan, and I think that's largely due to the need for U.S. pork, and in terms of Japan having that Phase 1 Japanese agreement, which was very, very beneficial for our producers. So it's definitely a mixed bag for us, but as we look towards the future, it's really important to expand markets beyond those that we've already captured and look at other markets like in Southeast Asia and into Vietnam and the Philippines. And we look forward to working with the Biden administration to make sure that our producers have that market access around the world and that barriers to trade are eliminated as much as possible.
All right, Maria, thank you very much for your opening remarks. Let's now go to Leslie McNitt, who is the Public Policy Director for Trade and Biotech with the National Corn Growers Association. Welcome to the Alpha Ag Summit, Leslie.
Thanks so much, Greg, and thanks to Alpha Media for having me join this great panel today. In 2021, the name of the game for NCGA is getting back on offense. Corn farmers spent the last few years dealing with a lot of trade uncertainty and really working hard to preserve access to our top export markets. NCGA notched some significant trade policy wins prior to getting hit by the coronavirus pandemic, and we've seen some market recovery in the last 6 months with strong signals coming from USDA and the markets about the future. In early February, the corn industry celebrated its best week in terms of corn exports in history, with 7.44 million metric tons or 293 million bushels of sales. And USDA is predicting that we could export a little over 66 million metric tons this year already. And we're already about 88% of the way toward that goal, largely in part because China showed up with unprecedented corn purchases this year. Just last week, ERS also projected a new record 157 billion in agricultural exports for 2021. And we're seeing, projections of a global coarse grain consumption expansion between now and 2030. So why do I say it's time to get back on offense? And what do I mean by that? Corn markets look good, but corn farmers are digging out of 6 years of challenges, volatility, and uncertainty. If we've learned nothing else from the last year, it's that things can change very quickly. So NCGA's goal on the trade policy front is to help farmers diversify their demand portfolio so that they're not overly reliant on any one market, yet still, of course, taking great care to supply and service our customers in our top markets. But we'll do that by pushing for new markets, new agreements, with some similar priorities to what Maria laid out. And we'll be working with the Biden administration and with Congress to really remind them and make the case that exports are critical to the rural economy's success. We'll push for a trade pact with Southeast Asian nations, the continuation of pending negotiations, and deeper trade ties with sub-Saharan African nations as well. We'll be vigilant when it comes to fighting trade barriers and enforcing our current agreements. And we'll be talking a lot more about the sustainable practices that go into corn and corn product production and the value proposition that offers our international customers. I know we're going to be diving into a number of these topics in more detail, so I'll stop there and say thanks again, Greg.
All right, Leslie, thank you very much. Let's go now to John Duff, who is the Executive Vice President of the National Sorghum Producers and Sorghum Checkoff. John, it's a pleasure to have you with us today.
Hey, thanks for letting us participate in this, Greg, and thanks for all you do, helping keep our farmers in the sorghum belt up to speed on everything. I believe Maria said it was a mixed bag. I think mixed bag is a really good way to put it. We have extreme, almost historic drought creeping into the Western Plains right now. On one end of the spectrum, and on the other end, we really have never had it better from a price and from a trade and an international demand perspective. We have seen over the last year a significant demand from China pick back up, really. Of course, 2013 to 2018 was one of the best periods ever in the history of the sorghum industry, owing to a significant demand from China. The trade war, of course, took that offline. Had to find other markets for the crop and largely did, weathered that storm, and now we have come out on the backside looking really, really positive. As we stand today, we've exported 233 million bushels, or had purchase commitments of 233 million bushels, I should say, on a 373 million bushel crop. So about 80% of that crop will go to exports this year, largely to China. We've seen historic price action, and really price action for new crop like we really have never seen before. We had purchases from China back in September of last year, and thus far we've had about 28 million bushels purchased on the next crop year, the crop year that will technically start in September for the crop that hasn't even gone in the ground yet. That's a very small number compared to exports of corn to China, of course, over the last couple of months. But for an industry the size of sorghum and for purchases and price action to come that early ahead of a crop, we're in a really strong position. We got farmers that are looking at having the ability to sell sorghum now at levels that we haven't seen since 2012, and there will be a lot of them that have the opportunity to sell sorghum for more than they sold in 2012 if we can produce a crop. So certainly drought concerns are going to be there. Just like Leslie and Maria, look forward to working with the Biden administration, look forward to what that dynamic is going to bring. Certainly with nominee Ty, there's going to be differences. Not good, not bad. I think they're just different, and definitely looking forward to working forward there on the things that we could have in common to move things forward on an international perspective. So look forward to the discussion here, and thanks again, Greg.
All right, John, thank you very much. Let's now go to Dalton Henry, who is Vice President of Trade Policy with U.S. Wheat Associates. Dalton, appreciate you joining us today.
Well, Greg, thank you so much for the introduction and the opportunity to be on the panel. I think it's going to be it is a good topic to be talking about in trade policy, especially on a day that we've got the new USTR nominee going in front of the Senate Finance Committee. So probably still a lot of things that we're going to have to be speculating about today in terms of how a Biden administration is going to approach trade, but certainly still something that is on the forefront of a lot of our minds. And I think you hit the nail on the head when you opened with the comment that trade is something that has become more and more important or more and more focused on by agricultural producers and organizations here over the last couple of years. You know, when I think about the fact that it's always been a major part of wheat producers' bottom line. Every year we export just about 50% or half of our wheat crop to customers around the world. But where we've been the last 2 or 3 years, if we think back to just 2 years ago, we had major uncertainty in some of our largest markets. USMCA was largely up in the air. We still had threats to withdraw from that agreement on a regular basis if changes weren't able to be made. We were behind the 8 ball in Mexico being our largest market from a wheat standpoint. It's tough to feel good about that one when we were in the moment. We were behind the 8 ball with Japan because of the comprehensive and progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement that gave our competitors in Canada and Australia better market access into Japan, our second or third largest market on an annual basis. And so we were in desperate need of an agreement there, and we were still completely shut out of the China market. So when we think about everything that happened in 2020 and the challenges that were there, and the really cool thing from a trade policy standpoint in the wheat industry is that we cleared the decks of those issues in pretty significant ways, right? We got USMCA implemented, preserving that #1 market. The U.S.-Japan trade agreement, phase 1 of that essentially went into effect just over about 13 months ago, preserving that second or third largest market. And now we're back in China. And since the phase 1 deal was signed, sold just over 3 million tons. That's going to make China a #2, potentially a #1 market this year if that pace of sales would continue. And so I think certainly still a lot of challenges out there, things to watch going forward, but also a much stronger position than what we've been in from a trade standpoint or a trade policy standpoint for several years.
All right, Dalton, thank you very much for your opening thoughts. And now to join us is Kent Back, a Senior Director of International Trade and Market Access with the National Cattlemen's Beef Association. Kent, appreciate you being here today.
Yeah, I'm really happy to join you and happy to be part of this panel. For the U.S. cattle and beef industry, we started off 2020 and it was looking like a great year. It was going to be a banner year for us. We had just seen the first implementation of a U.S. specific quota into the European Union, which was going to offer some marketing opportunities in one of the most protected markets in the world. And we also saw the implementation of the Japan deal, which was finally going to put us on a level playing field with Australia and Canada in our top export market. It was going to take that 38.5% tariff down and really allow us to capitalize on that strong demand in the Japanese market. And then probably the biggest accomplishment was the China agreement, the phase 1 agreement. there's been a lot of focus on the tariffs, but it's the non-tariff barriers that were really significant for us. The removal of the hormone ban, the traceability requirements, and the commitment to address the issues regarding beta agonists. All of those were major victories for us, and it really opened the Chinese market for the first time. That's a market where we've been banned for 13 years, and really the access we had was it was more of a foot in the door instead of open access, and now we've been able to really capitalize on that. The first few months of 2020 were pretty strong, and then when COVID hit, it kind of sucked all the air out of the room. But fortunately for us, we've made up for that on the backside of 2020, and we're really coming into 2021 looking much stronger. As Dalton said, and some of the others, our ability to recover because the removal of these barriers, it really puts us in a strong strategic position. And when you look at China specifically, we're very excited about that market. If you look at their total number of meat and poultry imports in 2018, it was roughly $10 billion. In 2020, that was up to $28 billion. So we've seen nothing but significant growth. I know a lot of that is in pork and poultry. Beef is really starting to come on strong, but we see a tremendous upside there. Moving forward to 2021, we see a lot of opportunity to reinvigorate talks with the United Kingdom. That is going to be a good opportunity for us to continue to engage on the importance of science-based trade as they move away from that EU doctrine and hopefully from that EU mindset and actually embrace science-based trade. But this is going to be an important opportunity for us to have important conversations on not only the science but animal welfare, antimicrobial resistance, and the impact of climate. And these are all big issues that are going to be addressed in 2021, and look forward to talking with those today.
All right, Kent, thank you very much for your opening comments. Now we're going to get to some questions here, and Kent, you were last to give your opening statements, but this is going to go to you first as far as the question is concerned. And you've always heard people ask, on a scale from 1 to 10, how do you feel, if you went to the doctor's office? Okay, I'm going to take it a step further. As we look at 2020 coming into 2021 for the livestock, in your case, Kent, or the commodities that are out there, if you used a 1 to 100 scale, with 1, of course, being poor, and I phrased as 100, it couldn't be better, where would you rate how trade affected the group you represent? Kent, we'll start with you.
I'm putting a number on it. I'd say you definitely have to be, in 80 or above, simply because we've seen such tremendous growth in exports in recent years. I think trade policy is going to have a very important impact on us. It's not only defending and capitalizing on the gains that we've made in the last few years, but it's engaging in opening all of these important foreign markets. Europe has there's going to be some tough fights, but we also have some tough fights throughout Southeast Asia, and we have a lot of opportunity there. And so I know that we're all curious to see how the Biden administration is going to move forward with trade policy. We all work very closely with them, and we feel very confident about agriculture being at the table and being able to engage. But I think that trade is going to have a very significant impact on our livelihood moving forward in 2021.
Let's go to Dalton Henry with your thoughts.
I think I'm probably pretty close to Kent. On a scale of 1 to 100, it's an 88 or an 89 for wheat. That kind of puts us in that B+ range. And if I was still a college student, I'd probably be arguing with a professor to round that up to an A. Just because we did make good progress in the last 12 months. We had a good year being back in the China market. I think, but in terms of could it have been even better? It probably could have. Securing a final agreement with the UK, as Kent talked about, the opportunity to put down a good marker for science and a regulatory standpoint, and also a bigger focus on proactively reaching out to new markets and securing market access. I think those are the two areas that maybe kept us out of that 90% range, but overall, certainly a year we should be able to feel good about on a trade policy front. John
Duff, what about sorghum producers? How would you grade it?
I would echo Kent and Dalton. I just want to say though before I elaborate on that God, man, what a difference 2 or 3 years makes. Everyone on this call 2 or 3 years ago was we would have been at the other end of that scale. We would have been circling that picture at the doctor's office with tears coming down because it was so bad for a little while. But yeah, I'd say I'm going to go ahead and round it up to a 90, Dalton. I think we're sitting in really good shape. We have certainly had demand that we haven't seen in about 7 years in this industry. And we could actually see this coming year with the amount of grain we're going to produce and the amount of demand it looks like there is in China, we could have our biggest year ever as an industry in terms of exports. With the price outlook the way it is, we could have one of our best years ever in terms of total value of the crop too. Why I wouldn't say any more than 90 is this drought. One, certainly if we can't make the crop, then none of this matters. Two, I'd say that while these prices are great, our input prices are still high as well. So that's a significant caveat there. And then third, going forward, there's a lot of work to be done. I think Leslie talked about sub-Saharan Africa. There's certainly a lot of work over the next few decades that can be done there. And we've got a long way to go with countries like India and others in Southeast Asia. So I think the possibility for multilaterals bilaterals over the next couple of years in the Biden administration and what we could do there could get that up to 100 in a few years. And we're really excited for what that could look like.
All right, Leslie McNitt, how about the corn growers?
Well, I'm reluctant to put a number on it because trade was such a roller coaster ride in 2020 that I think depending on the day, we probably hit most numbers on the 1 to 100 spectrum. It's amazing to think back about where we started 2020 with new trade deals being finalized, China, Japan, USMCA, and then we were hit by a pandemic that really decimated the ethanol industry. A derecho in the Corn Belt a little bit later on, and somehow we've turned it around, and a year later we're setting export records. And I just have to think about what that tells us about how resilient our industry has been. So I'm feeling really optimistic, and where there is room for improvement, I'd really like to see trade policy kind of create an enabling environment for more stability, more certainty in the marketplace, and a little bit more predictability about our long-term relationships and our long-term opportunities.
And Maria, Zieba, pork producers, roller coaster, as Leslie put it, and it's probably pretty apropos for what the pork producers saw in 2020.
Yeah, I think I'm more cautiously optimistic for 2021. Overall, the export numbers look really good, and we had record sales into China, and with the phase 1 with Japan, exports were really good in that market. But we also had the mixed bag of we were down in Mexico, and restaurants still being closed around the world, and a lot of what we're exporting goes into that food service sector. We still have those retaliatory duties into our Chinese products of 25%, while plus the regular duty of 8%. So while our competitors are paying an 8% tariff, we have to pay a 33%. On top of that, we're not in CPTPP, and those markets in those CPTPP countries are pretty big for us. But we've seen our market share decline because the Europeans inked their deal, as Dalton was talking about earlier, and Canada competitor moved ahead with theirs as well. So it's a bit of a mixed bag. I also, it's important to mention for our producers, inputs are going up, so that also hurts our bottom line. And we have a major threat of a foreign animal disease of African swine fever. So those are all the things that keep me up at night. And as much as the export numbers look good, we still have to be on the offense on a number of these issues.
I'm going to direct some of these individually now, Maria. As you look at this, what we hear from China is they are rebuilding their herd. They think they can get their herd back up to pre-pandemic levels, or excuse me, pre-African swine fever levels. Believe what you want from what we hear from China on that as well. How do you see what they're doing in China with still that threat, and they still have the threat of African swine fever, I guess another round of it here in China? How does the U.S. pork producer look at that news coming out, or what China says they may be able to do in rebuilding their herd to pre-ASF levels?
Well, I think in the Chinese market, there is a tremendous opportunity because of African swine fever. We know that they've had to cull approximately at least half of their pork population, pig population. So we know that there is a tremendous need, that the numbers play that out. But we also know that they have been trying to rebuild the herd. We hear anecdotally that they're having to cull some sows. So I think that the demand for the product is going to exist throughout this year, and we're still going to have big export numbers, but we still have that headwind of paying the retaliatory duty. And so it's a little bit mixed. I hate to be so optimistic about China when we still have a retaliatory duty, and in press releases, in media that we've seen, media coverage, Catherine Tai has said, those tariffs aren't going to come off anytime soon. Just be more patient. So it's still something that we're looking at, working with the Biden administration on removing the tariffs, and the Chinese want that too. But we're going to have to be more aggressive than we have been in the past.
Going over to you, Leslie McNitt, with the corn growers. Of course, we have seen the ethanol industry struggle in 2020. Lack of CFAP funding, lack of relief from Congress has caused a lot of issues, less demand in driving as well. How much of this that we've seen on the struggles of the ethanol industry, how much of it has led to maybe struggles as far as U.S. ethanol exports?
Well, I would say at this point it hasn't caused a supply shortage. I think, in recent years, just to give some context, ethanol has been a rapidly growing segment of corn and corn product exports, and it's been a real bright spot on the trade horizon for our industry. 2020 was challenging, as you've said, especially, as COVID resulted in fewer cars on the road in the U.S. and in other countries. That had serious demand implications. And ethanol has also faced some, and I don't, connect these trade barriers to CFAP or to COVID relief, but ethanol's faced some significant trade barriers. There's still a 232 retaliatory tariff for ethanol into China. There's a 20% tariff in Brazil, and those are two key markets. But despite all of that, exports of ethanol were down 9% from the prior year. And I think that, it could have been a lot worse. And that really speaks to ethanol's strong selling points as an affordable, clean source of octane. So, NCGA has been working to support our sister organizations in our, market development at the U.S. Grains Council and our ethanol industry partners, and continuing to really push back on unfair barriers and push for expanded use of ethanol in international markets.
By the way, you are watching the ethanol is among the topics of our trade panel. First portion of the trade policy panel is brought to you by Kansas Spray Foam Insulation. By the way, you can go to our website, alphaagsummit.com, to get more information and a chance to register to win quite the fishing vacation. If you go to that website, you can learn more about that. And let's go over to John Duff with the National Sorghum Producers. We talked about China and how important it has been as far as increased exports to China are concerned. Where are we seeing boats loaded with sorghum? What other countries have really started to step up as far as wanting U.S. sorghum?
Absolutely. Trade, of course, has always been like all the commodities on this panel. Trade has always been an extremely important component of the U.S. sorghum industry. NSP was founded in 1955. 1957, partnered with the corn industry to form the U.S. Grains Council. So we've been there from the beginning. It's always been very important. We've historically had a really good relationship with a number of countries worldwide. Mexico has always been a very important part of the industry. 15 to 20% of our crop is grown just within a couple hours of Mexico. Just a short line rail ride or a truck ride down, and you're in Mexico. That market has pulled back some as we've kind of tried to find an equilibrium point with more significant demand from Asia in that market. But long term, we expect Mexico to remain a very, very important partner. Japan, for the last couple of years, has been a significant partner, trading partner. I think as it stands today, they're probably second on that list of purchases behind China, and we expect that relationship to continue and evolve. We've done a lot of food work there, really kind of specialty niche markets, and we see that as a good growth opportunity. But looking forward, we see a lot of opportunities in Asia. You have a big trade policy win with Vietnam over the last year, and we see other opportunities there in Southeast Asia. And as I mentioned, and as Leslie mentioned, the opportunities in Africa over the next several decades are significant. I think by 2100, 5 of the top 10 most populous nations on earth will be on the African continent. Egypt, Ethiopia, Tanzania, Nigeria, Democratic Republic of the Congo. Those are historic trading partners or partners as an industry, not trade necessarily, but that is the cradle of sorghum production. And so historic relationships there in that region from a sorghum perspective send a lot over there for food aid, but we're really excited over the next few decades to see that relationship evolve and become a trade relationship. But there's going to be policy barriers, there's going to be development needs to happen, there's going to be infrastructure that needs to be developed. And so there's a multifaceted demand effort that's going to have to go into that over the next few years and next several decades, and we're really excited about that. So bright future for trade, I'd say, for the sorghum industry.
Dalton Henry, the word tariffs has come up several times during this discussion as well, and the tariffs that are in place already, and then we see the tariffs implied in the case of phosphates coming out of Russia and Morocco. How much fear is there of what we have in place as far as the tariffs are concerned, and how it could affect agriculture, or if they stay on, how much that could affect agriculture too?
The number of different tariffs that folks within agriculture have had to keep track of over the last 4 or 5 years, it has really skyrocketed, right? And you've already heard several of us today talk about 232 tariffs or 301 tariffs and all these different categories. And you mentioned phosphate, certainly a major input, and everyone today has talked about the challenge that rising input costs puts on our producers, and certainly something that needs to be taken into account as we think about, both how do we protect or empower domestic producers, but at the same time ensure that our producers have the access to inputs to continue to be some of the most productive farmers in the world. As I think that's going to be a big question. The other one that's really catching the wheat industry right now, and this is a perfect example of just totally unrelated items that we now have to quote Maria, stay up at night thinking about. That's the EU Airbus dispute, or Airbus Boeing dispute, right? Where U.S. subsidized Boeing too much, the EU subsidized Airbus too much, and now U.S. hard-red spring exports are completely shut out of the European Union. Historically a top 10 market there, for a dispute that they had nothing to do with. And so I think those are the kinds of disputes that are tough to predict that they're coming. But when you come in with a 25% tariff authorized by the World Trade Organization, that can completely change that marketing dynamic. Canada's going to receive all of that business until we get a tariff lifted or a resolution put in place. I think we're hopeful that a new administration, that's one of the opportunities they'll bring with them, is to hopefully resolve some of these disputes. But at the same time, it's tough sledding while we're in it.
And Kim Backus, I don't have to tell you about tariffs on what we've seen in Southeast Asia, just trying to get deals done, i.e. Japan, but other tariffs as well. It has a very wide-ranging effect.
Absolutely, and we're also the beneficiary of removing a lot of those tariff barriers. In Korea, we faced a 40% tariff. That's going to phase to zero in just a few short years, and that's given us a tremendous advantage over our competitors being able to do that. In Japan, we're seeing that tariff rate come down. So, I mean, trade agreements, they do open up a lot of opportunities for us by removing these barriers. But Greg, we're also paying attention to some new take on some non-tariff trade barriers. When you look at some of the restrictions that the European Union is trying to push on antibiotic usage, some of their subjective standards on animal welfare that in many ways, we far exceed through our beef quality assurance program and other, producer-led initiatives. But we're also going to have to pay attention to potential trade barriers when it comes to climate and environment, whether that's going to be carbon taxes or it's going to have increased standards that are inconsistent when it comes to different sustainability goals. So I think as an industry, we have to continue to open these markets. We have to continue to advocate for trade liberalization on tariff and especially these non-tariff areas. But we also have to be aware of all these new emerging areas where countries and groups like the European Union will try to erect new trade barriers.
All right, we got time, and I'm going to pose one more question to you all and get your comments on that. And Kent, I'll start with you, even though you had mentioned it already. The term climate change has become a very high priority within the Biden administration. Just your thoughts, expound a little further on how that's going to affect or could affect the industry and how NCBA and its members are embracing the discussions concerning climate change.
Well, I know for the beef industry, this is definitely something we've been looking at for quite some time. We've been engaged by telling our story. We have been in the business of sustainable cattle and beef production for many years. And, we feel that we are part of the solution, not the problem. And while we can't speak for cattle production in other parts of the world, here in the United States, we're doing it right. We are more efficient. We're very science-based because we can use technologies to increase these efficiencies. It means that we have a lower carbon footprint than many of our competitors. And I think that's all the more reason why we have to double down on science and the importance of it. But yes, I think climate is going to play an increasingly greater role in policies throughout the Biden administration, including trade policy. But I think it's important that we engage and we tell our stories. The other commodities that are represented here also have similar stories about what they're doing, and those are all very good stories. And we need to just step up our efforts in telling that story.
And Dalton Henry, we heard from some comments already from Secretary Vilsack on how big of a priority climate change is going to be within USDA too.
Yeah, it certainly seems to be the case, Greg. And I'll take it a step farther. Kent did a great job of covering that it's an area we need to be engaged in. And certainly our sister organization, the National Association of Wheat Growers, on a domestic policy front, it is part of several coalitions and efforts and has been for some time, just because we've seen an increasing trend in customers asking questions, not necessarily just from a climate change standpoint, but just an overall production systems, right? And that sustainability has become a buzzword. And many countries use that to try to implement specific rules or demand certain production practices. I think that's a trend that we've got to get our hands wrapped around and a discussion that we need to be a part of, or else it's going to end up in places that limit our producers' ability to operate. The UN this summer or this fall is going to be hosting a food system summit, not necessarily specific to climate change, but that's certainly going to be a portion of that. We have two very fundamentally different perspectives on the use of technology than a lot of other countries around the world that are really driving that discussion. And so that's a piece where us and as other producer organizations continue to be involved to advocate on behalf of U.S. producers and our ability to be sustainable and to be parts of the solution but at the same time, use technology and science to make that happen.
And John Duff, a lot of sorghum producers are out in arid, semi-arid areas that grow the crop as well. So climate change, depending on what region you're in, is going to be different from what you guys get versus some of those wetter areas across the growing region.
No doubt. There's a huge difference from north to south and east to west, not only across the country, but from one side of the field to the other. This is a really, really specific and macro challenge that we've got to take into account when we're talking about policy along these lines. But I would say I'll back up out of the weeds and say that we are really, really excited about the opportunity to have discussions with groups and with interests and with other organizations that we haven't always had common ground with. I think that we have an opportunity in agriculture here to build a bridge, regardless of anybody's thoughts and feelings on climate change, on environmental policy. Farmers want to steward the environment. Farmers want to be sustainable. They need to be sustainable. They need a healthy environment. They need clean soils, clean air. It is our lifeblood. And so I think that we have the opportunity to work with groups that want to see change in that area on things that can be mutually beneficial. And ag is, at least from my perspective, is ready and willing and excited, and the sorghum industry certainly is, to be that bridge and to try to find ways that we can improve our soil, but we can also improve the environment around us. As you said, sorghum is grown in arid areas. We're 75% no-till or reduced till. Overall, in a place like Kansas, we are almost 90% reduced till or no-till, and that's highest among all the crops. We have been doing a lot of sustainability work and practices at the farm level really since the Dust Bowl, out of necessity. And it's just a matter of quantifying that, finding ways where we can improve that, and then taking that ultimately to the consumer and to policymakers to figure out how we can get benefit for the farmers and how we can continue to provide more benefit back to consumers and society overall. So it's going to be an interesting and fun next couple of years from a sustainability policy and marketing perspective.
Leslie, representing NCGA, I know they have been out in the forefront concerning the climate change issue, but you throw this all together too, and is it going to affect trade? How this is all going to wash out as we go through the years.
Well, Greg, yes, NCGA's membership, has been engaging in sustainable farm practices for a long time, and we're really proud of that. We're proud of the work that we've done to improve soil health and start to collect data on those improvements to be able to tell our story of continuous improvement when it comes to the environment and farmer stewardship. I think that now is the time to tell that story globally. I think it's really important. I've met farmers from all over the world, and the first thing that when you get two farmers together, no matter where they come from, they typically talk about the weather, right? They talk about how they're adapting to the weather and how it's impacting their farming operation, regardless of size, scale, context, etc. So part of that conversation, and reflecting on this evolution in the U.S. and the continuous improvement in the U.S. is talking about how it's more important that we give farmers more choices and more tools and more options to adapt to climate and to continue to improve their outcomes, not fewer choices. And I think that's a conversation that we're going to be having more at the global scale to try and avoid some of the barriers that Dalton alluded to.
And Maria, telling the story around the world, as Leslie put it, that's a very proper way to be able to do that too, and that would include the pork producers.
Yeah, for our producers, it's really important to demonstrate and to show that we're doing the right thing. But we have to also convince our domestic consumers in the United States which is why we launched a campaign last month in January, Farming Today for Tomorrow, so that we can explain to U.S. consumers and those consumers around the world what our producers are doing on the environment and the positive impact that they're having. You know, our story gets lost. We have a great story to tell, but nobody knows about it other than our own producers, which is a real shame. For us as an industry, we've got to do better. Our producers account for 0.4% of U.S. greenhouse emissions. 0.4%, not even 1%. And yet we keep getting the media and consumers and saying, you know, you've got to do more, you've got to do more. Yes, I agree, we've got to do more, but we also have a great story to tell, which we've got to do a better job of communicating and getting out there and getting our message out there, because we're just not connecting with everybody that we should be connecting with. And so I think that this focus really creates a unique opportunity, because we've been doing the right things for years now, and this puts a good spotlight and we're able to really showcase and push forward that message that we do care about the environment, and our producers are really in it to make sure that they pass down their farms to their families, their kids, and everybody wants what's best for the environment and what's best for their communities that they live in.
Well, that will do it for our trade policy portion of our trade panel. We'd like to thank our panelists once again: Maria Zieba with the National Pork Producers Council, Leslie McNitt with the National Corn Growers Association, John Duff with the National Sorghum Producers, Dalton Henry with U.S. Wheat Associates, and Kent Backus with the National Cattlemen's Beef Association. The Alpha Ag Network, along with our sponsors, are proud to bring you this Ag Summit. A special thanks to our presenting sponsor, Hitchpin. The views and opinions expressed on today's panel are not those of Alpha Media and do not represent the viewpoints of Alpha Ag Network stations, their farm directors, or management. This broadcast is protected by copyright law, and credit should be given whenever sharing or reposting of this video. Alpha Ag Network is local farm programming, promoting, respecting, and celebrating the industry that drives our community's agriculture. Coming up next will be the trade numbers portion of our trade panel. But before we do that, here's more about our sponsor and the next portion of our trade panel.
Good afternoon. I'm Alan Van Amen, Product Development Marketing Manager for the Copper Cutter Aero Kits. We're proud to be a sponsor of the Alpha Ag Network Summit taking place. Anyway, our Copper Cutter Aero Kits originated out at the Copper Family Farms by Cimarron. We had a desire to create a header system to harvest sorghum in a very reliable method. We had tried using the old row crop heads and tried some short line headers. But out of that, we decided to take our corn heads, take off the worn out stock rolls, trash knives, and deck plates. And then we designed and developed our own dual disc cutting system that goes in place of the stock rolls and are driven by the gathering chains. Those discs, 9-inch diameter, simply run and turn variable speed through the field, do an excellent job at harvesting sorghum. Cuts the milo heads off, but leaves nice stubble in the ground for improved ground and conservancy, crop and soil conservation purposes. Anyway, our aero kits are available for John Deere, Case IH, New Holland, AGCO, and Gleaner combines and headers. Nice thing about it, it can be done on your own farm or it can be done by a dealer, and you can convert the corn head back to harvest corn again too. These heads also work not only for sunflowers, but also for sorghum, milo, and even some industrial hemp applications. Anyway, thank you and have a good day.
And welcome back to the Alpha Ag Summit. Once again, we'd like to thank you all for attending on whatever platform you are streaming this program on. Our panel discussion during the second part of the trade panel is brought to you by Copper Cutter. To learn more, go to www.copper, that's K-O-P-P-E-R, Cutter, K-U-T-T-E-R, all one word, coppercutter.com. Well, as we mentioned earlier, trade has become a more prominent topic of discussion among agriculture groups in so many ways. this portion of the panel, we are looking at what the trade numbers were in 2020 and what will be forecast for U.S. ag exports in 2021. So let's get to our introduction of today's panelist here on the program. Now, before we do, if you want to see more about our distinguished panelists, you can go to alphaagsummit.com and click on speakers to learn more about them. We are first joined by Dalton Henry, who is Vice President of Trade Policy with U.S. Wheat Associates. We're also joined by Reese Kennedy, who is the Manager of Global Trade with the U.S. Grains Council. And we're also pleased to be joined by Dan Halstrom, the President and CEO of the U.S. Meat Export Federation. So before we begin, we remind everyone that the views and opinions expressed on this summit are not those of Alpha Media and do not represent the viewpoints of Alpha Ag Network stations, their farm directors, or management. This broadcast is protected by copyright, and credit should be given whenever sharing or reposting of this video. So before we get into our questions, we are going to give the opportunity for each of the panelists to give an opening statement. So let's first start with Dalton Henry, Vice President of Trade Policy with the U.S. Wheat Associates. Dalton, welcome back.
Thanks so much for having me on for a second one today, Greg. And I think we able to talk a lot about the trade policy successes here of the last couple of years and why we're optimistic going forward. But strictly on an export numbers front, 2020. And now into, of course, 2021, certainly a year to feel good about from the wheat industry standpoint as well. We might not have quite the headline numbers that we've seen in corn and beans and a few of these other commodities, but at the same time, well up over our 5-year average. And with USDA projecting record overall agricultural exports into 2021, I think also reason to be optimistic going forward as well. I think, and really when a person wants to say, well, what happened in the last 12 months or last 13 months that's changed a lot of that? And the answer for many folks, and certainly probably the other panelists, and at least in part today, is going to be China. From a wheat industry standpoint, China is the world's largest consumer and producer of wheat. So a lot of potential there. Potentially a top, or certainly will be a top 3 export destination for U.S. wheat producers this year, but always a challenging one for us. And trade policy has finally gotten to a point where it can set us up for some success on a marketing front. But looking forward to talking more about all of that here in the next few minutes. Thanks for having me on.
Dalton, I appreciate you being on with us for the trade numbers portion of our trade panel. Let's go now to Reese Kennedy, who is Manager of Global Trade with the U.S. Grains Council. And Reese, it's a pleasure to have you on with us.
Hey, Greg, thanks so much for having me. I appreciate it. From a corn side of things, like Dalton mentioned, the big story has been China, and that's been the big change. At the beginning of this year, we were looking at probably a 3.5 billion bushel carryout. We were looking at stocks to use ratios that were we hadn't seen since the early 90s, late 80s. So, we were kind of faced with sort of a dire scenario when it came for sort of your supply demand situation. You take a few supply cuts, that the USDA did from last year's crop. You couple that with China's resurgence and coming in and buying over 17 million tons so far of U.S. corn. You really kind of set yourself up for the biggest drop during a marketing year that we've ever seen in stocks to use ratio. So this huge fall that we've seen in stocks to use ratio has obviously been noticed by the futures market and by basis. People are paying more and more for corn. This past week we didn't really see a whole lot of shipments. We'll talk about that in a little bit, but that's all pretty much weather related. At the end of the day, we've sold 87% or a little over 87% of the book that the USDA currently has penciled for U.S. exports. How high that number is going to get, I can't really speak to that, but I do know the USDA currently is watching shipments. That's going to be the big question. Can we get everything shipped? I think if we have good weather, absolutely that's going to be able to happen. But at this point, that's really what we're watching. We're watching shipments. Sales pace is well ahead of where we need to be to hit a record year.
All right, Reese, thank you for your opening comments. And joining us now is the President and CEO of the U.S. Meat Export Federation, Dan Halstrom, who hopefully isn't buried in too much snow out in the Denver metro area right now, because I understand they got hit pretty hard. So, Dan, I appreciate it. Thanks for joining us.
Yeah, good morning, Greg, and thank you for the invitation to join the panel today. In our world of beef, pork, and lamb, 2020, like everyone, was a year of change and adaptation and chaos. But in the end, the demand was very resilient. In fact, in some cases, excellent for U.S. beef and pork, and specifically. Several countries had increased consumption over pre-COVID, so we're encouraged by that. Breaking it down a bit, if you look at the pork global exports in 2020, we set a new record, just under 3 million metric tons, which was 11% growth over the previous year's record of 2019. On pork, as the previous speakers alluded to, the story, of course, was China. African swine fever greatly depleted their herds and their meat supply in China. But it's interesting, we saw the biggest impact in the first half of China, or the first half of 2020. The second half, we saw quite a bit lower numbers. And the exciting thing about that is that some of the other markets were picking up the slack. Japan, Philippines, and even Mexico in the last quarter of 2020. On the beef side, global exports, we finished year 2020 down about 5%. We did have some good news, though, in there. We had Japan up. We had China up dramatically from a very low base, but up. And Africa was up. So the encouraging thing on the beef side was the fourth quarter was record-breaking. We were up about 9% year on year, with very, very large numbers on beef exports for the last quarter to Japan, Mexico, and China in particular. So I think we're pretty optimistic going into 2021. We are forecasting a new record on pork, a slight record over last year, and we're also forecasting a significant rebound on beef for a new record over 2018.
All right. Thank you, guys, as far as your opening statements are concerned. So one of the things I want to do is direct questions as well. And if you have any questions out there, if you're watching this, you can go to the chat area, and we will be screening the questions as well to make sure that we get those questions on, and those will pop up when we get the chance as well. So we'll get to that here in just a bit. Dan, I want to start with you. And, we've had conversations. I remember a conversation you and I had, and along with Joel Haggard back in November, of the fact that it was a different situation with COVID in that there were a lot of countries in Southeast Asia that opened up a lot quicker than everyone else did as well. But that's the trickle-down effect in that, well, then people will want to eat. People will want to eat beef. People want to eat pork, lamb, whatever the case is. But that was interesting to watch, and I'm sure for you guys, interesting to see how some of these countries were handling what they did with COVID.
Yeah, without a doubt. It was interesting to watch the whole world react. In Southeast Asia, of course, they were the first ones to experience it in January of last year. Taiwan comes to mind. They were probably the least impacted in our world. Maybe a couple of weeks where they saw some partial lockdowns, but otherwise it's been business as normal there, other than there's no international tourists coming in. And you have other markets. China's had a real tough go for a few months, and they're getting back pretty much on a very good trend line back to normal, and Vietnam stands out as well. So, yeah, we're pretty, Joel, you mentioned Joel Haggard, our senior VP that oversees Asia. He calls it, what we're seeing in this part of the world is revenge spending. People are tired of being locked up, and they're going out and they're spending a lot of money, either to eat at home with higher value food sources, or having more often going out. In a lot of parts of Southeast Asia, food service is fully reopened. So compare that to Latin America, for example, where we're still struggling with a lot of COVID-19 lockdowns.
Reese, this question's for you. I heard comments earlier in the week about how China has changed some of the way they feed their hogs over there, in the aspect they don't feed them scraps and everything else. It's more of a Western style, so to speak. One would think that would be a pretty good driver on the demand for corn, or the demand of the type of feed or feed that the Chinese will need to be able to feed their hog population, pork population, and with the numbers that they have.
Yeah, it's a significant portion of the herd that was being fed with food scraps. So for those of you that are unaware, roughly anywhere, I've heard estimates as low as maybe 20 million metric tons and as high as 40. I think a lot of people kind of settle on the 30 million metric ton number. 30 million metric tons of food scraps before ASF were fed to the hog herd in China annually. And that's, again, kind of a rough number. And it's difficult to say how much corn that equates to or how much soybean meal that's going to equate to in a diet. But at the end of the day, we know it's significant. 30 million tons is not really a drop in the bucket when you talk about demand for coarse grains or any other feedstock. So yeah, I mean, it's significant. I think there are other factors as well, Greg, that have kind of played into this. One thing that I don't hear talked about a lot, that's something that I do think about is, we know that in those record corn auctions that China held over this past year and last year, a lot of that corn was 4, 5, 6 years old. And there were a lot of complaints coming out of China about the quality. And, we here in the U.S., we know that 4 and 5 and 6 year old corn, it just doesn't perform in a diet the same way that new crop does. And so when we hear about these mass auctions and their huge stockpiles that they have, well, you may have to put a limiting factor on that. You may have to put a 0.5 in front of it because it may be 50% as effective. Now, I don't know how to measure that or come up with a concrete measurement, but there is some economic loss there that needs to be made up. When you're milling this poor quality corn, you're going to wind up with a necessity to have more feed for your pig operation or your duck operation or whatever you're feeding. So, and those are just two of a lot of, you also had the monsoon or the typhoon, in the northeastern portion of China, and they estimate that took out 8 million metric tons of production. Dalton mentioned they're the largest wheat producers in the world, or they're the second largest corn producers in the world. And so, when 8 million metric tons comes out as a net importer of coarse grains, they just have to bring that in. You have also the Australia deal. I mean, there's a lot of things that have happened here all at the same time to kind of create a perfect storm for coarse grain exports from the U.S. to China. One of them is that change in feeding tactics. The other one would be the old corn, geopolitical issues. It's pretty numerous, Greg, and how much they affect, how much each factor affects this sort of magnetic pull they've had for U.S. corn this year is unknown. But each one is certainly significant.
Dalton, Reese talked about quality, and we've always heard that about Chinese wheat as far as the low quality is concerned. And you had talked about, the percentage of how much of their wheat stocks in the world that are right in China as well. I guess my question simply, does quality matter in this case, knowing the quality we have of the U.S. wheat crop that we have?
It certainly does. And we probably, and on both ends, right? So we would see the same potential for quality challenges that Reese is probably talking about on a corn standpoint, right? That when you've got, as USDA estimates, somewhere around 160 million tons of wheat. I mean, that's essentially, think about it as 2 entire U.S. crops in storage in China. Now, yes, they do consume a lot in a year, but that's still well over a year's worth of consumption right there. So I think there is an open question about quality of those stocks. And is it still going to be, used in the milling sector for flour? But I think the other piece, when we think about the quality opportunity in China, is that when you look at domestic Chinese production, by and large, it's kind of a medium protein winter wheat. Now, they do have a little bit of spring wheat production, but not nearly what the U.S. would have. And so as you see a rising middle class in China demanding, newer and higher end baked goods. I don't know if it's quite to the point of Dan's, revenge eating cupcakes that's driving that, but certainly higher end baked goods. That's going to require both the lower protein wheat than what they have domestically. So we think about our soft whites and soft red winters, and it's going to include the higher protein wheats than what they have when you're thinking about pizza crusts and, hearth loaves. And so really a lot of opportunities within China, not just on total volume, but on qualities of wheat that they just don't produce domestically. And that bodes well for U.S. producers.
For the past several years, we have heard there's less demand for bread. There's less demand for products that use wheat. Are we starting to see that change as far as maybe getting more people to look at eating products that contain wheat?
It's an interesting question, Greg, and certainly in the case of the U.S., right, when we've looked at a number of diets that have encouraged lower carb consumption, flour consumption in recent years is maybe in the last decade, right, it's trended down. Recent years has kind of flattened out. I think it's going to be interesting to see what COVID does to that. As people return to cooking in the home and home baking and home consumption, there's certainly going to be trends to watch there. But bigger picture in the rest of the world, while there are areas that have followed the U.S. in that, there are also substantial areas of growth where people are, shifting from rice to baked goods, or shifting from simply flatbreads to higher end baked goods. And so overall, as we think about wheat production in the last decade or consumption, we've added 100 million tons of consumption to the balance sheet. Now, we still probably, a lot of people would say, have too much wheat in the world because we have put 7 of the last 10 years worldwide have been record wheat production years, but 8 of those 10 have been record consumption years. So certainly still a very strong consumption story there. I think as we think about the potential for a drought in the U.S. plains this year, certainly western Kansas down into the Texas Panhandle and up into Colorado is feeling that, and the Russian wheat export tax situation that they've put in and have really removed a substantial amount of Russian wheat from coming onto the world marketplace to fill demand in importing countries. It doesn't take long for us in wheat to go from feast to famine, and folks start to panic just a little bit about where those supplies are going to come from.
Reese, as we talk about what U.S. Grains Council covers, and a lot of that looks at corn, sorghum, and barley, we don't forget about some of the byproducts, in other words, ethanol and DDGs. Have we seen, how have we seen those numbers go? And, you can look at China or other places because China obviously is a big customer of that. But how have we seen those exports look? And what do we see the forecast of as we're getting into 2021?
Yeah, when you talk distillers grains and other sort of corn-based co-products, as we call them, corn gluten meal and corn gluten feed, all of these products have really been interrupted very, very harshly by the container shortage. The container shortage has been a real issue for these products that traditionally move very well out of Chicago. Currently, we're seeing huge spreads between bulk vessels and FOB Chicago values. There's a lot of supply right now in Chicago with not a whole lot of ways to move it around. You've got folks down south that basically in New Orleans that basically can choose from soybean meal and DDGS, and right now that choice is soybean meal. I think going forward from a macro level, you probably look at distillers grains to be a pretty cheap form of protein throughout the year. If there's I think a lot more that would contribute to a tighter soy balance sheet than a corn balance sheet. And so that said, there will be some opportunities for distillers grains buying. The only thing I'm a little worried about, Greg, is sort of the health of the ethanol industry going forward. For the sake of American agriculture, they've essentially battled through what has been their toughest year to date. So it's been very, very difficult for them. And if you have any of these sort of supply disruptions where you see, for instance, this past week or the past 2 weeks with this extreme cold that we've seen, you saw intense supply disruptions. We saw ethanol output go down to 683,000 barrels per day. We haven't seen that level since May 10th of 2020, which was during sort of like the crux of the initial lockdown, when we saw ethanol production essentially fall off a cliff for 2 months. So that these kind of significant supply disruptions cause spikes in distillers grains prices, whether it's freight or domestic issues. So that would be the one thing I would be concerned about. When you look at Q4 exports for last year for distillers grains, you had a lot of folks that were reporting record Q4s, up until basically late December when the container shortage began. Then at that point, I think Q1 is probably going to be pretty slow for distillers grains here in 2021 once that data comes out from GATS, and then we'll see how Q2 does. I think a lot of people are optimistic going into the summer about how the ethanol industry is going to react. I think people are optimistic about the vaccines. That's also very important for the ethanol industry. If we can get people back on the road and have this continued optimism, I think people will stop being so concerned about distillers grain supply. And once that concern, I think, alleviates a little bit, the economics of the situation should then just take over, at which point I would think distillers grain should price in really well for a lot of folks, going into Q3 and Q4 of this year. So that said, going through these difficult times right now, but it's not to say there's not a little bit of brightness on the horizon.
Dan Halstrom, and I don't know how to describe this, as you look at 2020 and really how it seems like Australia, for what they have, seem to be on the outs, or not. A lot of countries aren't real happy with them as far as trade is concerned. How do you look at that as far as, that's one of your main competitors in Southeast Asia, but how do you look at what Australia has gone through?
Well, not only have they gone through some challenges with some of their trading partners like China, they're also in that part of their supply chain with a shortage of cattle and a shortage of available product to sell into Asia. So they're getting rain, so their feed is ramping back up. So the supply chain will change. Where our forecast is that they're probably going to struggle through 2021, but by 2022 we're going to see more availability coming out of them. But we've definitely made gains in our Asian markets in the last year, and we're forecasting it'll be again this year, specifically in China and Japan, our two largest markets, and China as well, although China has less to do with Australia because our high quality grain fed beef into China is really quite unique, and I'm really looking at that as incremental business. So as we're going forward into 2022 and beyond, Australia will continue to be a very big competitor. And just to coattail on Reese's comments on the supply chain, the beef and pork industries are dealing with the same sort of challenges as it relates to the container situation. Our situation is probably more severe on the West Coast, Long Beach in particular, but it's now backing up into Houston and even reports off the East Coast. So this is a situation that can really change things in a hurry if it gets any worse. So we're going to need to keep an eye on that.
A reminder, this portion of the Alpha Ag Summit is sponsored by Copper Cutter. You can learn more about our sponsors by going to alphaagsummit.com, and a chance to win a great trip down to do some deep sea fishing, a 4-day trip. You can learn more about that on our website at alphaagsummit.com. Let's continue with our discussion, and Dan, we'll come back to you. We talked about what's going on in Southeast Australia, but we can't forget about Europe, or in this case, trying to penetrate that European market, not only separately, I guess, the deal with Great Britain, but also trying to make inroads in the EU. Have you feel like we've started to make some good progress there?
Well, the U.S. beef industry made some progress actually in early 2020 with our U.S. zero duty quota that's exclusively for the U.S. And this was a big step in the right direction because we had a very limited quota prior to that. So that's a success, but it doesn't address the overall issue of dealing with Europe. I have a lot of optimism around a possible breakthrough with the UK. The UK now officially being out of the EU, they have an incentive to possibly expand their supply base beyond continental Europe. And this could be an opportunity for the US. And I think we all know how restrictive they are in their policies as it relates to production technology and adoption of some of the modern day technologies that are approved to be used in the US. So hopefully that, I don't think it's a short-term fix though. This will take time. And hopefully they can come to a successful conclusion with the UK-US trade negotiations.
Reese, so much of the focus, and rightfully so, has been looking at Southeast Asia, specifically China. But from the U.S. Grains Council perspective, what are some of the markets maybe that we're not talking about enough that we have seen growth and we have seen some good inroads being made?
Well, I mean, I could quickly kind of talk about the Med C market, and that's really just based on Ukraine's crop failure this year and them having to set an export total on their corn. They put a quota at 24 million metric tons. So we were able to get a lot of that Med C business back. Now, that's not without, some detriment to feed demand over there. Feed demand has been hit pretty hard in a lot of the North African countries. You're missing tourism. So when you look at countries like Tunisia, Egypt, countries that do rely heavily on tourism, feed demand is it's simply lower. But at the same time, again, because of Ukraine's crop failure, this is just how it all works, right? You've got to backfill it from somewhere. And the U.S. has been a pretty good partner there. And I think we may continue to be if Brazil's corn crop continues to be delayed by all those rains. We may have to fill in some boats that are traditionally filled in by Brazil there in the late spring, early summer timeframe. So, but other ones, and I always say this, Greg, it's the markets that we're not really talking about that are going to carry us to the finish line. So China comes out and buys 6 million metric tons of corn in a week, and that's really fun to talk about. But at the same time, you've got countries like Mexico that are slowly chugging along, and until that week when they bought 6 million metric tons, I probably would have said Mexico would be our biggest market this year. We'll see how high they're able to get. Right now, I believe they're around 8 million metric tons of purchases from the U.S., but they traditionally buy anywhere from 13 to 16. They're kind of in that range. So they've got quite a ways to go. We've seen a country like Peru come back after an anti-dumping case was brought on American corn producers. We were able to sell some boats into Peru. In fact, they were the leading country on this week's export sales report. So, it's certainly a group effort when it comes to corn purchases from the U.S. And that's what happens when you produce 377 million metric tons of a crop, right? I mean, it's got to go somewhere. And luckily, we have really, really good partners around the world.
Dalton, a lot has been mentioned about this container issue that's becoming a serious, if not critical, problem. For those who may not be familiar with that, what's been the biggest factor, or I guess, why are the supply of containers not there as far as what we need and what the U.S. grain industry, U.S. livestock industry needs?
Absolutely. I may let one of the other guys take this one. I think the big issue, right, has been empty containers being sent back empty, just because it's making more money for a shipping company to do that. We've been fortunate in the wheat industry to be a little bit more isolated. Containers has always been a tougher business for us. It's tough to beat the cost savings of shipping 60,000 tons on a bulk vessel. And when we don't have to worry about refrigeration that the meat folks have, or shipping substantial distances inland into importing countries, we've fortunately have avoided a lot of that. But I know it's been a hot one for a lot of producers out there, and I'm sure Dan or Reese could probably talk even more.
Dan or Reese, you want to expand on that a little further?
Yeah, thank you, Dalton. Yeah, I think what we're seeing is it's a combination of issues. Number one is, especially on the West Coast, we have a shortage of employees, absenteeism due to COVID-19 concerns or sickness or some combination. The labor was short before COVID, and now it's really short. So that's one issue. And then you have the differential in freight rates between the eastbound routes coming back from China to the U.S. versus the westbound routes going out of the U.S. to places like Japan, Korea, and China. In our case, we're hearing reports of freight rates 5, 6, 7 times those going westbound coming back eastbound. So it's an economic decision, and which is problematic for us at the moment. And our freight rates here are going up. So in a democracy, the economics will eventually win out, and you'll see adjustments. But that's not going to help us today. I mean, we have a situation today where we have reports of a lot of members having, hundreds of containers backed up over the course of just a few weeks. So this is definitely something that's gaining steam every week the last few weeks.
And Reese, you want to add any comments to that?
Yeah, I just want to expand on what Dan said. He talked about the economics of it all, and just to kind of explain that, particularly when you talk distillers grains. I can't really speak for beef exports or anything like that, but when we talk distillers grains, the container arrives in Long Beach, and like Dan says, it's 6-7 times more expensive to go eastbound than it is to go westbound. So the quicker they can get back to going eastbound, the more money that container can make. And so if they spend time going to Chicago and loading with distillers grains only to send it back on a cheap fare, that's not efficient. And so the efficiency of it all is what's taking over. And so I just wanted to explain that for those that may not be following it as closely as we are.
You're watching the trade numbers portion of the panel. We've gotten into some great conversation here with our three gentlemen. Reese Kennedy, who you just heard from with the U.S. Grains Council, Dalton Henry with U.S. Wheat Associates, and Dan Halstrom with the U.S. Meat Export Federation. And gentlemen, I want to end with this question. And Reese, I'll start with you, as a matter of fact. Now, I know each of you, your organizations, have offices around the world, and going through the pandemic, of course, has been different depending on where your offices are located. Can you talk about the experience, or what those people who work in your international offices have had to go through, and how much of what could be in person normally has had to be via Zoom or via online in whatever form?
Yeah, the new world, right? I mean, Zoom has certainly taken over all of our activities, and it's made everything. I would say, as far as technical development, it has halted progress. It hasn't stymied it, but it's definitely put it to a point where it's slowing down a little bit. It's not to say that we're not constantly meeting with everybody. It's just that operations are moving a bit slower. When we used to be able to be there and help conduct feeding trials, now we're doing that all over Zoom. And that is certainly not as easy with time changes and getting information communicated and getting consultants on the same page. Everything just moves a bit slower. But I will say that we're probably busier than ever when it comes to just volume of programming. So the volume of programming and interaction has certainly expanded past what I would have even imagined we would be capable of doing in a Zoom-led world. But we've had pretty much all hands on deck. And at this point, we're starting to see hybrid events. It's very weird for me to see myself on a screen at the Four Seasons in Seoul while other people sit around and watch. So it's just very odd to do that in a digital setting. But it seems like we're getting back there. Like I said, with all of this confidence in the vaccine, it seems like we're going to get back to traveling at some point. It'll probably be slower than everyone would like it to be, getting back and developing these markets. I do want to make one comment, though, about Brian Lomar, who is our director in China, in Beijing. Brian actually flew back to the United States to stay away from the coronavirus when it first started in February. He spent almost an entire year here, only to see that the U.S. actually probably had far more cases and far bigger an issue than they had on ground zero. And then he went back to China and went through a 14-day quarantine where he was not allowed to leave his pod with his wife. And so I think they have certainly come out of that much stronger. And Brian is now safely back in Beijing on the ground. So we're slowly getting people back into their offices if they're U.S. nationals. And these are all good signs of progress.
Dalton Henry, how about U.S. Wheat Associates?
Certainly probably a very similar experience to what Reese described for Grains Council, right? So we've got 13 offices around the world outside the U.S. And a wide range of staff there. And there are, there's been highs and lows, right? So on one hand, pushing everybody into the virtual setting has allowed us to, frankly, reach more people. If we were to just put up a chart of trade contacts this year compared to trade contacts at the same time last year, there's no question that the numbers aren't even in the same universe. But that's because you can put additional folks in a virtual conference that you simply couldn't when you're trying to bring multiple countries together in some of these conferences. But in terms of where the harm has been or where the lows come from is especially on our ability to provide technical service, right? To put a professional miller in a flour mill with a customer and demonstrate firsthand how to use U.S. wheat to get the maximum amount of that quality out of it. And I think that's the piece that we need to come back, right? That there's a lot of the virtual stuff that we will, I expect, it's another tool in the toolbox to say, we will keep things that we've learned from this past year and use them going forward. I think big conferences, our big buyers conferences, are probably one of the last things to come back, just because to get 200 people together at a hotel, especially in a food service industry, companies are going to be nervous about that. But to bring technical service back would certainly be a big thing. We've got an incredibly resilient crew around the world that work on behalf of U.S. wheat producers to promote those products. And I know they're definitely getting ready to get back into the actual just ability to see folks in person.
And Dan Halstrom, will end with you, how that has been affecting your personnel across the world for the U.S. Meat Export Federation.
Yeah, very, very similar to Reese and Dalton's comments. We've got about 75 folks outside the U.S. in 19 regions around the world, and it's another tool in the toolbox, like Dalton said. And I think as things get back to a new normal, these will be very important tools to use going forward. But that being said, I think the fact that we have people in the markets on the ground has made it easier to deal with the pandemic. Even though maybe they're still working remote or only partially in the office, we have had meetings ongoing. It's smaller groups, but you can still get people together. And I think it's versus trying to manage it all from the U.S., that I can only think that would have been the worst case scenario. So in that regard, we feel fortunate to have these folks around the world. But, I think as things come back to some new normal, we're going to see these tools be something that will be a norm, not the exception, which will, I think in the end, just make us stronger.
Well, I kept these gentlemen longer than I anticipated, but I very much appreciate them joining us to talk about the trade numbers portion of the panel. So we'd like to thank Dan Halstrom, President and CEO of the U.S. Meat Export Federation, Reese Kennedy, Manager of Global Trade with the U.S. Grains Council, and Dalton Henry, Vice President of Trade Policy with U.S. Wheat Associates. The Alpha Ag Network, along with our sponsors, are proud to bring you this Ag Summit. A special thanks to our presenting sponsor, Hitchpin. The views and opinions expressed on today's panel are not those of Alpha Media and do not represent the viewpoints of Alpha Ag Network stations, their farm directors, or management. This broadcast is protected by copyright law, and credit should be given whenever sharing or reposting of this video. Alpha Ag Network is local farm programming, promoting, respecting, and celebrating the industry that drives our communities, agriculture. Coming up on the Alpha Ag Summit, we'll hear from 6 farmers and ranchers during our Farmer and Rancher panel. Our producer has been Shayla Reilinger. I'm Greg Akagi, along with our colleagues Scott Columby and Kim Miller. Thank you for watching this portion of the Alpha Ag Summit.